This is the fourth Sunday in Lent. And again, we have a really long story out of the Gospel of John. What it boils down to is a story of sight versus those who can't see. And Jesus uses this metaphor, but also a very physical healing to demonstrate what's going on. We first start off as Jesus is walking along with his followers and sees this man who he acknowledges is born blind. No one knows exactly how he knows that, but we're just going to, it's Jesus. We're just going to assume that he knows. And the apostles with him right away say, so who did this? Was it the man's sin or was his parents' sin that caused him to be blind? Now remember, these are Hebrew people, so sin for them is a separation. Sin is either a separation from God or it's a separation from each other. But they ask, who did this? And Jesus explains to them that no one did this, no one's actions. He was born like this. One of the tropes of soap operas that has always driven me absolutely bonkers is this sense that my actions cause harm to my children or harm to me or some other. It's used so often in soap operas. I mean, they really shouldn't be dabbling in religion anyway because they present it so badly, but it's a constant where someone's fault and might generate story, but it is bad theology. And the disciples ask this really awful theology, and Jesus corrects them. Nothing. This man was just born blind. Some things just happen. Now, depending on the translation you're using for the next line in this, it'll either say something along the lines of, "This situation was created so that God could do the work." That can be problematic as well, because we start developing an assumption that people with a handicap are there to teach us something. And those who are dealing with handicaps are really quite annoyed with that kind of assumption. Better translations are, God is working through this situation. See, it's not that God caused the situation. It's that the situation exists, so God is able to use it. And that's in a whole lot of things. So they continue walking. They run into this man. Jesus heals him, puts mud and spittle on his eyes, and tells him to go wash in the pool of Siloam. And then the man comes back. He'd heard Jesus. He'd heard the authority. He went and did what he was told. And he comes back and he starts slowly to see things. Now, his sight is both metaphorical and physical in the story. He slowly sees, first he sees this man named Jesus. Eventually, at the end of the gospel, he sees Jesus as the living Christ. But he's not there yet. And he sees this man, and then he goes and tells his neighbors what's going on, that I can see. And his neighbors, they're split. Some don't believe he was ever blind. Others believe it's a miracle because, yes, they know that he was blind. And they debate among themselves. And then they bring him to the Pharisees at the temple. And then people in the Pharisees say, was he really blind or not? And yes, I was blind, he says. And he explains what happened. So the question between the Pharisees is not whether we believe him, or not only whether we believe him, but also if we believe him, did Jesus' actions, were they sinful actions or were they good actions? And the man standing there, it's like, how can anything good happen out of sin? But the rabbis are so caught up, the Pharisees are so caught up in their own very rigid understanding. Remember, this is the Sabbath. No one does anything on the Sabbath, except Jesus always did things on the Sabbath. And they are not able to see what the man is demonstrating for them in a spiritual way. They are struggling over the physicality of his sight. So they even bring in his parents and say, is this really, was he really born blind? And his parents say, yeah, he really was. And they don't want to get into it, which is kind of interesting because as a parent, I would have gotten into it. But then the man continues to say, this is what happened to me. And the parents say, he's of age. He can tell you what went on. But they just cannot get out. And they say they're followers of Moses. That's supposed to mean something. They just cannot break out of their very narrow version of what faith looks like to accept that this could be an act of faith, this could be a spiritual miracle in their midst. And then the man continues to say, it's Jesus. Are you going to be his followers too? Should I be his follower? And that just sets off the Pharisees. Now, remember, this is not the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where eventually everybody kind of figures out what's going on. This is John, where everyone knows right up at the beginning what Jesus is about, who he is, why he's there. And the Pharisees are just up in arms trying to resist this. And the Pharisees are not wrong ultimately. They're very narrow minded, they never get the point, but they see Jesus as causing political trouble with them for the Romans, and that actually does happen. So the Pharisees have reason to be suspicious, but they cannot get out of that sense of control, the sense that we know what's going on. Nothing that you're telling us fits with our rigid understanding, our very narrow view of how God works. So we have to reject you because you challenge us. And that's what they do. They send him out of the temple. And then he finds Jesus again. And the Pharisees are there. And Jesus explains to them that there are people who are not able to see, but after they have an encounter with Christ, they start to see. And there are those who think they see, but they are perpetually blind. And he's again talking about the Pharisees, but he could be talking about church leadership. He could be talking about all sorts of groups, even today. We do not recognize what miracles are. We don't necessarily respect other people's experience of encountering Jesus. It's a very difficult thing because we, especially in church leadership, we pride ourselves on having a pretty healthy walk with God. So when we are shown something that doesn't fit into that dynamic, it really doesn't work for us. We want to manage it or manipulate it somehow. Years ago, I was visiting a church community where they were very much into laying on of hands and group praying, and almost everybody collapsed when they had prayers as a sign that the Holy Spirit was very much working in them. And so I went up, and it was my turn, and I got in this crowd of people, and they all were putting on hands on me, and I started to feel a pull. And I resisted the pull. And finally I said, do not pull me down. And they stopped. I was talking with someone afterwards who said, oh, I felt the pull too, but they wouldn't do that, would they? Yeah, they would, because their very narrow version of what a spiritual experience looked like included people falling down. Now, one of the reasons I knew the difference is because when you fall down naturally, your knees buckle. My knees were fine. This is pulling at my shoulders. We have so many people within faith communities that are trying to dictate how others can experience Jesus. Here's a man who really doesn't know very much about him, but he decides to follow based on what was done for him, which is not an uncommon experience. He sees, he hears, he recognizes a miracle. He's able to think outside the box, to see outside of the rigid framework that he's been raised in. His parents can't. His parents are scared that they're going to be excommunicated, so they don't do anything about it. The Pharisees, they're very strict in what they want to do because they present the law, and if anybody's outside of that, how do they have authority? So they're not able to see anything different. But Jesus tells them, I am the light. I am how you see. I am how you understand, how there is more here than meets the eye, how your sight is just a physical part of your understanding. You've also got a spiritual sight and be able to see beyond expectations. The Pharisees weren't able to do that. They are perpetually blind. A man outside of that is able to see. The message is very clear to us who want to follow Jesus, to put aside expectations, to kind of break down the rigidity of the walls around us. Try to see things differently. Children have this ability. In the children's and kids corner, I talk about what miracles look like. That we talk about miracles as big things, like someone getting their sight or someone being able to walk. These are the big miracles that we encounter in the Bible. But everyday miracles happen all the time too. Cars that stop when they're supposed to, so you can safely cross the road. Telling a person that they're fantastic or they're beautiful, and just the light that shines through them. These are everyday miracles that we are part of. Jesus is part of that. God's part of those miracles. Whether we take time to recognize them or not is our problem. But it doesn't mean they don't go on. And when we stop and recognize the miracles, contemplate a leaf, especially those of us who live in the Eastern Canada where we see them change color over a 6 or 8 month period. Contemplate that and see God active. That's a miracle. That we find love is a miracle. That we can educate ourselves and learn more and have a relationship with God is a miracle. We have this ability as long as we get out of our way and stop thinking in very, very narrow terms. We can see the light that Jesus is bringing to us. We have to be open to it, because if we are not, we will continue to be blind and we will never understand what everybody else can see. That we don't stay in the mystery. There's something there for us. We just have to trust it and wait and be. This man didn't ask. Maybe we don't have to ask either. We just have to not get in our own way.